What I love to do is introduce the right people to the right people.
I assemble the smartest people I can think of or reach out to carry that conversation, and that's exactly what I've done today.
Please give my panel a round of applause. Welcome.
Okay, guys, Jay Martin here, CEO of Cambridge House, and I'm joined again by Peter Schiff, the chairman of SchiffGold, the founder of EuroPacific. Peter, how are you?
I'm doing well today. How are you?
Good. I'm really good. Yeah, good to see you again. You know, where I wanted to start is I've got a question for you, something I'm trying to wrap my mind around right now. I think that most people who pay attention to the markets right now would agree that inflation's going to run hot. And I think that most people who pay attention to the market right now would agree that the Fed's going to continue to suppress rates. And historically, that formula that creates negative real rates has been the setup for a rising gold price. But that being the case, for the last 7 months, the opposite has been proven true. And so my question for you, Peter, to start is, what am I missing? What are we missing here?
Well, I think the key to the reason that gold hasn't done better is, first of all, we did have a pretty big run leading up to this period. I mean, gold hit 2,100 and change last year. And so nothing moves up in a straight line. And at that point, when gold was at its peak, a lot of people were bullish. And we know that markets don't like to go up when everybody is bullish. So generally, something has to happen to shake confidence so that enough bulls turn bearish, right, before you can have a base to build another rally. So I think what you're missing on the inflation threat is, yes, most people see that inflation is going to run hot and that it's going to be north of 2% and maybe even north of 2.5% or maybe 3%. I mean, people, will vary on how much they think we're going to overshoot. The Fed has already said that they're okay with an overshoot because the Fed is confident that it's only transitory and that even if we have higher inflation as measured by, the CPI for 2021, maybe even 2022, that it's going to be short-lived and we're going to be back into our sub 2% zone, right? So I think to the extent that the markets agree with the Fed that the increase in inflation is temporary, it's hard to argue that then, we should factor a temporary increase in inflation into the price of gold, right? Because, you're talking about a long-term forecast for inflation when you're moving into gold. But I think the other factor is that people still expect the Fed to fight inflation, especially if it ends up getting out of the comfort zone. I mean, maybe headline inflation does come in at 3.5%, 4%. I think what everybody thinks is that, the Fed is going to have to tighten in the face of that big overshoot, right? So I think the markets are also bracing for the fact that, maybe we're going to get more inflation than the Fed is bargaining for. And therefore, the Fed is actually going to tighten rates a lot sooner than they're now indicating because their current posture is based on inflation not getting too far above 2%, even though they haven't specifically said how high above it they're comfortable. I think the markets are trying to get ahead of that by thinking, it could be a lot more than they think. And therefore, the Fed's going to have to raise rates sooner than they're saying. They may have to start, tapering off their bond buying sooner. And so I think that's also scaring the gold market somewhat, that the Fed is not going to be as easy as the market thinks. Now, I think the market is wrong on both counts, right? I mean, I think that inflation is actually going to overshoot by a much bigger margin than pretty much anybody thinks. I don't believe that it's temporary. I believe it's the beginning of a protracted period of much greater increases in consumer prices. I mean, the Fed tries to hang its hat on the fact that the last 10 years or so, or 20 years, we haven't had a lot of inflation. And the Fed says, that means that, that's the new normal and we're never going to have it again.
Right.
I think that was the aberration. I think we're going to go back to normal. And I think there were some other factors that helped to mitigate the impact of inflation, which is the expansion of the money supply, on U.S. consumer prices. I mean, one certainly was the CPI that was dramatically changed in 1998, and all of a sudden, magically, inflation disappeared after we rejiggered the CPI because we claimed that it was overstating inflation, so we had to fix it. And I think now it understates inflation. So that's part of it. But a lot of it had to do with China and their willingness to accept our dollars and exchange for their products and just buy our treasuries and supply our market with all sorts of consumer goods. So there were these, extenuating factors that I think made the lag between printing money and increasing prices longer than normal. It didn't stop it. I mean, we're going to see the impact. We're just seeing it later than we might have in the past. But so the other thing, though, that I think the markets have got wrong is not only is inflation going to be bigger than they think and not be transitory, but the Fed's willingness or even ability to do anything about it really doesn't exist. I mean, the Fed could talk all it wants about how it's going to fight inflation if it was wrong and inflation became a bigger problem. I just don't buy it. I don't think the Fed is going to do that. They can talk a tough game, right? They can bark, but they will not bite. Because think about it from a practical point of view. They've already said 2.5% inflation. That's not going to worry them, right? A little bit above, maybe 3. And they've also said they want to wait at least a year. They're not just going to look at a blip up in inflation. They want to make sure that the inflation isn't transitory before they take action. That's what Powell's already said, right? They want proof. They're just not going to look at it. They're just going to assume it's transitory unless they're proven wrong. So let's say they wait. And as they wait, the inflation just gets bigger and bigger and bigger because they didn't act preemptively. And now a year goes by and maybe inflation is 6%, 7%, and it's headed higher. And now the Fed is like, okay, we were wrong. It wasn't transitory. We got an inflation problem. Well, now they got a bigger problem in trying to solve it because now they have interest rates still at 0. What are you going to do if inflation is 5%, 6%? Move interest rates up to 25 basis points, 50 basis points? That's not going to do anything. They got to move interest rates up to maybe 8%, 9%. I mean, it's not even a possibility that they can go anywhere near that amount. They're going to have to start unloading U.S. treasuries and shrinking the balance sheet. They would create a far worse financial crisis than anything we took place in 2008 if they actually had to fight inflation because they waited too long and let it get out of hand. So my thinking is they will not fight inflation. They're going to surrender. Inflation is going to win without a fight. And so when people understand this, that inflation is going to be much greater than the Fed thinks or anybody thinks, and it's permanent, and the Fed is never going to do anything about it. There is no way to put out the fire. Gold will just go ballistic when people, finally connect those dots.
Okay, there's a ton in there I want to unpack. I want to jump back to one point you made sort of midway through about CPI, because you were tweeting like last week, CPI is another government lie. And just now you referenced the changes they made in 1998. So my question for you is, what changed and why now should we not trust this number?
Well, the government always makes changes to their methods of measuring things, whether it's GDP or inflation or unemployment. And they always tweak the numbers to produce a better result as a report card. It's like, if the students were allowed to kind of change the way they were graded, like the methodology for coming up with their grades, would it surprise anybody that all of a sudden they started getting more A's and B's and fewer, C's and D's, right? Because they were in charge of it. So the government always wants to make the good stuff better, like economic growth, and the bad stuff worse, like unemployment or inflation, right? So they want to find ways to make those numbers little and the good numbers big. So they made a lot of changes in 98. Very substantial ones, because they were taking into consideration the recommendations of the Boskin Commission, which according to the Boskin Commission, the CPI was overstating inflation. So they introduced other, formulas into the computation of the number to try to correct that, right? So they deliberately wanted the CPI to be a higher number. because they were being told it was overstated. I mean, they wanted it to be a lower number.
Right.
So I'm not really sure. There's a lot of geometric weighting and substitution and hedonics and all sorts of stuff, right? That I don't really understand all the exact changes. But I know they were profound. And I think this period of, oh, wow, we have low inflation. It's not a coincidence that it followed this major revision into how we, calculate it. And I did this in 2013 and you can see the whole video. I did a big video on inflation. It's on my YouTube channel. But this was in 2013, right? And I said, I think the CPI is understating inflation. And I had a bunch of ways a bunch of baskets, but there was one thing that's easy to look at. And my video is a lot more comprehensive. I did a lot more analysis of different prices. But just to point out one of them, because I remember it, it was newspapers and magazines. So according to the CPI, from 2003 to 2013, newspaper and magazine prices were up by 30%. That's what the CPI said. Now, I figured, well, this is easy to check because all the newspapers and magazines have their prices on the cover.
Right.
So all I had to do is use the internet and get pictures of those magazines from 2003 and get pictures of the same magazines in 2013 and compare the cover prices.
Sure.
Right? So I did like 20 magazines, and they were the big ones: Times, Newsweek, USA Today, US News and World. I did New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. I just took really big magazines, right? I don't know the exact ones they used, but they must have had a lot of the ones I used, right? Because I used the biggest ones.
Sure.
And I just compared the prices in 2013 to the prices in 23, added them up, took an average and said, okay, how much more expensive are these magazines today than they were 10 years ago, right? Very simple. And I got about 130% increase in price.
Okay.
So the actual increase in price was 130%, but the CPI scored it as if the prices had only gone up 30%. So that is a huge amount of increase that totally was not captured by the CPI. Now, the question is why, right? How did the government take these numbers and get them so that they were so much less than the actual increase? Maybe they said the newspapers are better, they're printed on better paper, maybe they're delivered faster. I don't know. Maybe they assumed that people weren't paying the cover price, that more people were using subscriptions and getting discounts. I mean, I don't know what they did. But the result was that 130% increase turned into a 30% increase. And so this stuff is going on with a lot of products, not just newspapers and magazines. So, the measure is not honest. And of course, it's interesting because the government keeps complaining there's not enough inflation. Yet they're the ones that are cooking the books to pretend that inflation is lower than it really is. Because what they're really trying to do is get the go-ahead to produce more inflation, which is printing money. This is the problem, is that people are focusing on an effect of inflation and ignoring what inflation actually is. Inflation is an expansion of the money supply. It's the money supply that's being inflated. Prices can't be inflated. Prices can go up, they can go down, but they can't be inflated. It's money supply that's inflated. And when you have more money and then you're chasing a certain amount of goods, well, the price of those goods goes up. So inflation causes prices to go up. It isn't prices going up. And obviously we have massive inflation. We've never been printing this much money. So the question is, when is all this inflation going to manifest in a way that's, more obvious when it comes to consumer goods? And I think that's already happening. But, the CPI will never reveal the true extent of these price increases. But it's going to be more and more obvious as the true rate of inflation is so much higher than what they're officially reporting. There's only so much they can shrink the packaging. There's only, because a lot of the inflation comes because they just, give you less, or they substitute lower quality ingredients,
sure.
or, stuff that used to come assembled. Now you got to assemble it yourself. I mean, they find different ways to lower the quality and not increase the price. And I'm sure the government's not picking up on any of that. It's probably, if the quality improves, they calculate that, but they probably ignore all the circumstances where the quality is diminished.
Interesting. Okay, now I want to jump to a quote that Powell came out with recently. I could probably guess your take on it, but I want to dive into it a little bit. Where he came out and said there's no longer a relationship between increasing the money supply and the value of that money, right? No longer a relationship between increasing the number of dollars and the value of those dollars. So just to jump into it, what's he talking about? And what's your take on that?
Well, he's trying to say that in the past, right, printing a lot of money would have been negative for the value of that money, would have been negative for the dollar.
Which is obvious. Yeah.
Right. If he's saying that that's no longer the case, I mean, that is a ridiculous statement. I mean, maybe you could say that for the last several years, that hasn't been the case. But to say that it'll never be the case makes no sense whatsoever, because you're basically saying that the law of supply and demand has been suspended, that somehow it no longer matters. I mean, obviously, if the U.S. government mailed everybody a check for $1 million, we wouldn't all be millionaires. We couldn't all go out and buy, expensive sports cars. I mean, there's just not enough of them to go around. The prices would have to go up. I mean, they can't make everybody a millionaire by giving them $1 million. I mean, they could make them a millionaire, but you'll have to be a billionaire to buy things at that point, because being a millionaire won't matter because everybody will be one. So to make a statement like it's unlimited, I mean, like we could just print as much money as we want, and we're never going to destroy the value of the money that we're printing. The money that you're printing, when you're printing paper money, you're not mining gold. See, when you bring gold out of the ground, you are introducing a new resource into the economy. You're bringing gold, which has all sorts of uses, right? And so the world is wealthier because a resource has been harvested and now is available for use, right? Mm-hmm. But when you print money, we don't have anything that we didn't have before the money was printed. So all money does is enable you to buy the goods and services that have already been produced. And if those goods and services aren't there, the money means nothing. Doesn't matter how much you produce if there's nothing to buy. And you just can't keep printing money. Prices just have to go up. What we need is more goods, not more paper to buy the goods. And so his statement is just so asinine, and it reveals, either a complete misunderstanding or lack of understanding of basic economics, or he's just lying and just figures that, nobody's going to pick up on it, right? He doesn't really believe it. He just doesn't want to admit the problem that they're creating by printing all this money, or get holders of U.S. dollars to start to worry more about the value of all the dollars they're holding on to. And not just foreigners, but Americans who may have dollars and that they're holding on to or saving that they're hoping to use to buy stuff in the future. If they understood the truth that those dollars may have no value in the future or very little value, they wouldn't hold them. They'd be getting rid of them right now, which is not what the Fed wants, because that would accelerate the crisis.
So that's I guess where I struggle with this, because I have to assume that Powell does understand basic economics, right? Like,
I don't know.
Right. I mean,
no, man, he may not. I mean,
it's possible for sure. Anything's possible, but I assume he's an intelligent individual, probably has his biases and his blind spots and his internal pressures that I'm not privy to, but he's got to be a smart guy, right? That's my assumption. I could be wrong there, right?
Well, he could be smart in intelligence and IQ, but there are a lot of smart people that believe a lot of dumb things. So
for sure,
intelligence is not necessarily something that's going to keep you from making these mistakes.
You're right. And I guess what I therefore wonder is how much of this is just to pacify sentiment. It's just to pacify the public, pacify the holders of dollars. Like, is that the core? Do you think that's the core motivation? It's to keep everybody calm, to avoid the crisis mindset. Everything's going to be okay. It's just that narrative.
Yeah, well, I think a large part of the Fed's job is public relations and spin, and to try to create a false sense of confidence in the U.S. economy, in the U.S. dollar. I mean, I remember I watched an interview or listened to an interview with Ben Bernanke, and he was being interviewed, I think, by maybe it was Motley Fool or some podcast or Yahoo Finance. It was something. But he was no longer Fed chairman. And so the guy that interviewed Bernanke played for Bernanke clips of Ben Bernanke talking in 2005, 2006, saying everything is great, there's nothing to worry about, we don't have a housing bubble, oh, the subprime market is contained, we're not going to have a recession, right? All these assurances that he was making that we shouldn't worry, everything was fine, right? And he plays Bernanke these clips. And then he says, well, how does it make you feel, right, to have been so wrong, right? Because clearly, it wasn't contained. There was a bubble. We had, not only did we not avoid recession like you assured, but we had the worst recession since the Great Depression, right? So he's basically like, look, you couldn't have been more wrong. And here you were, chairman of the Federal Reserve. You had all this information more than anybody else, right? Now, he didn't say, hey, Peter Schiff was out there saying it's a housing bubble, we're going to have a financial crisis, right? He didn't bring me up. But he's basically saying, look, you had more information than everybody, yet you were so completely wrong. Like, how do you feel like knowing you were so wrong, right? And instead of saying, yeah, I really feel kind of dumb now that I look back, God, what was I thinking? I was so clueless. What Ben Bernanke said to basically save face, his answer was, well, I couldn't exactly speak forthrightly or honestly. I can't remember if he said honestly, but I couldn't actually say, what I actually thought because I was part of the administration, right? And so as I had to kind of toe the official party line, and I'm thinking, what? This is what he just said? Because the Fed is supposed to be independent. But what Powell basically said is, look, you shouldn't believe anything I was saying as Fed chairman. Bernanke, because I'm not going to tell you what I honestly think. I have to tell you what the administration wants you to hear, that everything is great. And so that's basically what he was saying. Look, the reason I got it wrong was because I wasn't trying to get it right. I was just trying to reassure everybody that everything was fine and there was nothing to worry about because I was part of the administration. So this is what this independent central bank, and I'm surprised that these admissions didn't get, any more reaction in the media. I mean, I'm the only one I've ever heard comment about, such a statement. Right. But I mean, he really, let that out of the bag. And I think that these Fed guys, the Fed chairman, they're just like, people from, propaganda from the government. And also, I think the Fed, they think that confidence is very important, right? They don't want to do anything to shake confidence. In fact, they want to try to instill confidence if they think confidence maybe is waning. Sure. And so they look at it as like, oh, we got to talk how great everything is. And even if they think that there's going to be a recession or a crisis or the dollar is going to crash, they're not going to say, gee, we think the dollar is going to crash. Because if they say that, well, then it's going to crash even sooner. Even if it wasn't going to crash, their statement warning of a crash could cause one. Sure. So I think they're very, very concerned. They don't want to accelerate the onset of the crisis they see by acknowledging that they see it. They want to postpone that as long as possible. And they think one way to postpone it is just to pretend it's not even a threat and get everybody to not be concerned and then hope that maybe it works out better or that maybe they're wrong or we never have a crisis. So I just never believe anything that they say at the Fed. I mean, I don't believe what politicians say either. And so I don't believe they're any different. And I don't believe that they're truly independent. I think, yes, they want to pretend they're independent, but that's part of the bluff to instill confidence in the dollar, right? That, oh, these independent central bankers, well, they would never allow inflation to get out of hand. They're going to raise rates. They're going to force the government to cut spending. They're going to force companies into bankruptcy. They're going to force real estate prices to crash. They're going to force stock prices to crash because they don't care about politics. Mm-hmm. They want to preserve the dollar. No, I think they care as much about politics as the elected representatives who appoint them. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. And I'm with you on all that. And I think that the confidence bullet point is so critical, not just like internally with, Americans, worried about a dollar crash, but foreign dollar holders, maintaining their confidence is obviously super important. But I mean, what other tools does the US have? I mean, towing the party line, making sure, we appear like everything's fine, hold the dollars, no worries. Doesn't matter how much we print, it's not actually going to affect the value. But there's obviously other like foreign policy leverage tools they have, right? Either through threatening of sanctions or other actions. Do they not, to ensure foreign dollar holders aren't dumping dollars? Are there other tools in the tool belt?
I don't think there are. I mean, I think that we risk biting the hand that feeds us. I think if we start being overly aggressive to people who have dollars, that just creates another incentive not to have them. And that also instills a greater sense of urgency to divest from the dollar and to no longer rely on the dollar as a reserve currency or for a lot of international cross-border exchanges, because, the U.S. runs that risk. I think they've already crossed that line where we've abused that privilege and we've put on sanctions to the extent that I think there's already a desire for that reason alone to get away from the dollar, to diminish the influence and power that the U.S. has over the rest of the world by virtue of its ability to deny access to dollars.
Sure.
Right? And so what it really boils down to is what we have is our military. But is that something that we actually are going to use? The Soviet Union had a big military and they collapsed. I mean, they didn't use their military to try to avoid that collapse. The whole empire disintegrated. So I don't know, like, are we going to tell people, hey, hold these dollars or we're going to invade you or we're going to bomb you? I mean, I don't know that we would even do that.
Right.
So, and if the dollar crashes, I mean, we got bigger problems. We can't even afford to pay the military. I mean, there's going to be chaos at home that they're going to have to deal with. So I think the only thing we've got going is the fact that the rest of the world, hasn't, come to this conclusion yet, right? I mean, they still have confidence in this system and in the dollar. And, but the question is, how much longer will that happen? Because we've already asked them to, increase substantially the amount of dollars that they'd be willing to absorb or allow us to print. I mean, we're going off the charts now with deficit spending and money printing. I mean, the government is spending about $8 trillion a year, a little over, and it's not even collecting $3.5 trillion in revenues, taxes. And that's before this $2 trillion spending bill got passed. So, I mean, we're spending money like crazy without any regard to our tax revenue. And so all of that is basically a tax on dollar holders because it's financed by inflation. And so we're asking the world to bear a heavier and heavier burden of maintaining this system of the dollar reserve status. And, how much longer will they do that? And as they foster the idea in America that, hey, everything is free, like, hey, it doesn't matter. We can have whatever we want. Green New Deal, reparations for slavery if we want, government guaranteed employment. We can forgive all the student loans. We can have Medicare for all, and we're going to pay for it by printing money. I mean, the world is just not going to, go along with that.
Right.
And so there's going to be a crisis soon because we have upped the level of dollar printing to such a degree that they've got to back off. I mean, we've got to be in the final innings of this game.
Okay. Look, Peter, it's been great having you back on. I appreciate your perspectives. So thanks very much. For anybody who's curious and wants to catch up on more of your content, I'd check out Peter's YouTube channel, check out Schiff Radio, and for all the products that you can now offer to Canadians as well. A majority of my audience is in the US, but I'm Canadian. I'm North.
Yeah. We're all licensed and ready to go at EuroPacific Asset Management in Canada. So yes, 100% we can work with Canadians. Finally, It took a long time for IROC to approve us, but it finally happened. So persistence pays off.
Yeah, right on. Okay. Well, thanks again, Peter.
Okay.